I want to tell you about a morning in November 1883, when a man named Philetus Norris stood at the top of a 33-foot mound of earth in the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia and gave the order to start digging. Norris was not a university professor. He was a Union colonel in the Civil War, a fur trapper, and the second superintendent of Yellowstone National Park. A man who had spent more of his life outdoors than most scientists spend reading about it. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology had sent him to West Virginia with a specific task: excavate the mounds along the Kanawha River near Charleston and determine once and for all who built them. There were approximately 50 of them, scattered across 8 miles of river terrace, some as small as 3 feet high, others looming over the landscape at 35 feet. Norris started with the largest, a perfect cone known locally as the Criel Mound, sitting equidistant between 2 enormous circular earthworks, each 556 feet in diameter. He opened a 12-foot wide shaft from the top and began cutting straight down. The first 3 feet gave him fragments of a skeleton that had already been disturbed decades earlier when locals flattened the top to build a judge's stand for horse races. He kept going. At 4 feet he found 2 more skeletons lying on their backs, heads pointing south, accompanied by stone celts, hoes, lance heads, and carved discs. He kept going, past 10 feet, past 20, past layers of packed clay and ash that had been deliberately placed there by someone who understood exactly what they were building. At 31 feet, the original ground surface, the floor on which the entire mound had been raised, he found the chamber. A wooden vault, timber walls, timber ceiling. Inside, on a platform of elm bark blanketed with white ash, lay 11 human beings. 10 of them were arranged in a circle, feet pointing inward like spokes of a wheel. In the centre lay the 11th. A.R. Signs, the assistant who helped Norris excavate the chamber, measured the central figure at 6 feet 8 3/4 inches from the crown of the skull to the heel bones. Broad-shouldered, massive teeth, a thick, low skull encased in a copper headband. The Smithsonian's own nomination form later added a caveat. The extreme height might have been exaggerated by earth pressing down on the burial. That is one reading, but here is another. Norris went on to excavate the Great Smith Mound, also in the Kanawha Valley, and inside a timber mortuary house at its base he found a central figure he measured himself at 7 feet 6 inches, with 19 inches between the shoulder joints, wrapped in bark and sealed in dry clay, conditions that would have preserved the skeleton's position precisely as it was laid. His field notebook, which still exists as a manuscript in the Smithsonian archives, refers to this individual repeatedly as the giant. 2 mounds, same valley, same expedition, same man doing the measuring. One skeleton recorded at nearly 6'9", another at 7'6". Both surrounded by others arranged in formation around them, both buried with copper, both sealed in timber vaults beneath thousands of tons of earth that someone moved by hand. Whatever you make of the exact inches, these were not ordinary burials of ordinary people. And here is what stayed with me. 10 people around one. Their feet pointing toward him, as though even in death they were oriented to him, not beside him, toward him. Whatever these men were in life, and I will spend the rest of this video trying to understand what they were, the people buried around them were placed in a pattern that says, this person was the center of something. If this is your first time on this channel, I should tell you that what we do here is follow evidence wherever it leads, especially when it leads to places the official narrative would prefer you not look. If that sounds like something worth your time, subscribe now, because what Norris found beneath the Kanawha Valley was only the beginning. The Kanawha Valley in 1883 was not empty land with a few interesting bumps in the ground. It was one of the densest concentrations of prehistoric earthworks ever documented east of the Mississippi. Cyrus Thomas, the man who would later compile the Smithsonian's definitive report on mound explorations, counted 50 mounds in the immediate vicinity of Charleston alone, ranging from modest burial heaps to monumental structures rivaling anything in Ohio. But the mounds were only part of the picture. Between them, Thomas documented 8 to 10 circular earthworks, enormous rings of raised earth enclosing anywhere from 1 to 30 acres. The 2 circles flanking the Criel Mound were each 556 feet across, not approximately, precisely, and they were equidistant from the mound, placed with a symmetry that implies measurement, planning, and a spatial understanding that goes well beyond what you need to bury a chief. I spent time last year with the maps that Thomas drew of the Kanawha Valley complex. What hits you is not any single feature, it is the system. The mounds are not randomly scattered, the circles are not random sizes. The whole thing reads like a ground plan, like something designed as a unit, not accumulated over centuries by unrelated groups doing unrelated things. Thomas himself described this as the second largest known concentration of Adena mounds and circular enclosures, stretching for miles along both sides of the river. Stone mounds lined the bluffs above the floodplain, earthen circles enclosed the terraces below, and at the center of the entire complex sat the Criel Mound and its twin rings, like a fixed point around which everything else was organized. The official interpretation treats each mound as an isolated burial site, each circle as a separate ceremonial enclosure. That interpretation may be correct, but it requires you to believe that dozens of monumental constructions, built within a few miles of each other by people who shared every element of material culture, were not part of a single coordinated project. I find that harder to believe than the alternative. The people who built the Kanawha Valley mounds are called the Adena. That name comes from the estate of Governor Thomas Worthington in Chillicothe, Ohio, where one of the first mounds attributed to this culture was excavated. It is not a name these people gave themselves. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. We know them almost entirely through what they buried and what they built, and what they built is extraordinary. The Adena culture occupied the Ohio Valley, the Upper Kanawha drainage, and parts of Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and Indiana from roughly 1000 BC to 200 AD, over 1,000 years. During that time, they constructed hundreds of conical burial mounds, some reaching 70 feet in height, and surrounded them with circular and sometimes octagonal earthworks of enormous scale. They traded copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and obsidian from sources as far away as Yellowstone. They practiced elaborate burial rituals involving cremation, red ochre, and the construction of timber mortuary houses that were deliberately collapsed and covered with earth. And they were, by every measurement available, physically large. This is not fringe speculation. William Webb and Charles Snow at the University of Kentucky published detailed osteological analyses of Adena skeletal remains in the 1940s and 1950s. Their data showed a population with robust skeletal frames, pronounced brow ridges, heavy mandibles, and a consistent pattern of heights exceeding 6 feet, in a period when the average human male on the continent stood approximately 5'5". Some individuals in their sample approached 7 feet. Webb and Snow described the Adena skull type as large, with a pronounced brachycranial index and a protruding lower jaw, unlike anything in surrounding populations. The central burials at Criel Mound and Great Smith Mound, whether you accept the lower measurement or the higher one, were at the extreme end of this range but not outside it. They were the upper boundary of a population that was, on average, significantly taller and more heavily built than any contemporaneous group in North America. And that fact, documented in peer-reviewed publications by university-trained physical anthropologists, generates almost no curiosity in the institutions that funded the research. I keep waiting for the follow-up study. It has not come. I want you to hold the image of that burial chamber in your mind. 11 people, 10 in a circle, 1 in the center, feet pointing inward. Now I want to tell you that this was not the only time this pattern appeared in the Kanawha Valley. At the Great Smith Mound, Norris found a timber mortuary house, 12 by 13 feet at its base, 6 feet high at the walls, rising to a ridge at 10 feet. Inside this structure lay a central figure surrounded by 5 others whom Norris described in his notes as probably volunteer warriors. The central figure, 7 feet 6 inches, 19 inches between the shoulders. At Criel, 10 surrounded one. At Great Smith, 5 surrounded one. Different numbers, but the same principle. A single individual at the geometric center, others arranged radially around him. The mound itself, built not as a heap of dirt over a grave, but as a deliberate architectural project. Vault, then collapse, then earth, layer after layer, rising to a cone visible for miles. Now consider this. Webb and Snow documented a similar pattern at Adena sites in Ohio and Kentucky, central burials of large individuals in log tombs, surrounded by secondary burials, the entire structure sealed under progressively larger layers of earth. The pattern repeats across hundreds of miles and multiple centuries. The same burial geometry, the same emphasis on a central figure of unusual size, the same materials, copper, mica, shell, red ochre. Whatever was happening in the Kanawha Valley was not local. It was a system. It had rules. And it produced at its center individuals who were physically unlike anyone around them. Something was selecting for size, or producing size, or honoring size in a way that no other culture on the continent was doing at the same time. The mounds remained, the ritual ended, and no one in the centuries that followed built anything like them again. The Kanawha Valley was not alone. In 1838, 45 years before Norris arrived, 2 men named Abelard Tomlinson and Thomas Biggs tunneled into the Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville, West Virginia, the largest conical burial mound in the entire state, originally 69 feet high and 295 feet in diameter at its base. Someone had moved more than 57,000 tons of earth to build it. Inside, Tomlinson and Biggs found 2 burial vaults stacked one above the other, timber-lined, containing skeletal remains, hundreds of shell beads, copper bracelets, and a small sandstone disc, inscribed with characters that have never been definitively translated. The Grave Creek stone, as it became known, generated decades of debate, accusations of forgery by a local physician named James Clemens, who had financed the dig, and eventually silence. The kind of silence that descends when a question becomes too uncomfortable to keep asking. But the mounds kept giving things up. In 1774, a man named Jack Parsons was walking along the flooded banks of the Cheat River in what is now northern West Virginia, when he noticed bones protruding from the eroded bank. He pulled out a femur. He held it against his own leg. It was 7 inches longer. He excavated the rest and estimated the skeleton at 8 feet. Other settlers found similar remains nearby. The locals started calling it Giant Town. In the 1850s, workers digging a root cellar in Palatine, now East Fairmont, unearthed 2 skeletons over 7 feet tall. Multiple witnesses saw them. By morning, both had vanished, reportedly sold into the market for Indian relics that was thriving at the time. In 1930, Professor Ernest Sutton of Salem College excavated 2 mounds in Doddridge County and recovered skeletons he measured at 7 feet 6 inches, the same number Norris had recorded at the Great Smith Mound 47 years earlier. And in the late 1950s, well within living memory, Dr. Donald Dragoo, curator of the section of Man at the Carnegie Museum, excavated the Cressup Mound in Marshall County and unearthed a skeleton he measured in the tomb at just over 7 feet. He described the long bones as heavy, with marked eminences for the attachment of muscles. He published a photograph of the skeleton in his 1963 book, Mounds for the Dead. The photograph exists. The measurement exists. It was taken by a trained physical anthropologist in a professional excavation funded by one of America's major museums. And it generated almost no follow-up research. Not no evidence, no follow-up. That distinction matters. I drove to South Charleston, West Virginia, to stand at the base of the Criel Mound. It sits in the middle of a small municipal park called Staunton Park, residential streets on all sides, a gas station 2 blocks away. Someone built a concrete sidewalk up to the summit. There is a concert stage on one side. A historical marker at the base gives you the name, the date, and a sentence about the excavation. It does not mention the height of the central burial. It does not mention the 10 surrounding figures arranged in a circle. It does not mention the copper headband or the formation. It tells you the Adena built this mound approximately 2,000 years ago, and it was excavated in 1883. That is technically accurate. It is also the minimum amount of information required to say something without actually saying anything. I stood there reading that plaque and thinking about where the bones went. Here is the answer. Between 1881 and 1890, the United States Congress allocated $5,000 per year to the Smithsonian for the explicit purpose of investigating the mound builders. The Bureau of Ethnology sent agents across the eastern half of the country. They excavated over 2,000 mounds. They collected skeletal remains, artifacts, copperwork, mica, carved pipes, shell gorgets, and everything they could extract. And they shipped it all to Washington. This was not a secret operation. It was federal policy. The Smithsonian actively encouraged local excavators to send their finds to the Bureau's Mound Exploration Division. By the mid-20th century, the institution held over 17,000 Native American skeletal remains. In 1989, Congress passed the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which required the Smithsonian to begin identifying and repatriating remains to affiliated tribes. The 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act extended this requirement to all federally funded institutions. Thousands of remains have been returned since then, but as of 2023, the Smithsonian still held approximately 10,000 sets of human remains, more than any other museum in the country. Within that collection are bones from the Kanawha Valley, from the Criel Mound, from the Great Smith Mound, and from dozens of other sites where field agents recorded individuals well over 6.5 feet tall. The 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, published in 1894, contains Cyrus Thomas's massive Report on the Mound Explorations, over 700 pages detailing what was found and where it went. The central burial at Criel Mound is described as a once most powerful man of very large size. The surrounding 10 are noted, the copper, the bark, the ash, all recorded. But nowhere in that report, or in any subsequent Smithsonian publication, is there a systematic analysis of the skeletal dimensions of the individuals recovered from the Kanawha Valley. The data was gathered, the bones were shipped, and then the conversation about what they meant simply ended. In 1963, Donald Dragoo published Mounds for the Dead through the Annals of Carnegie Museum. In it he laid out the excavation of Criel Mound in meticulous detail, every burial numbered, every bone described, every artifact catalogued. Burial 54 was the large one, just over 7 feet, heavy, long bones, pronounced muscle attachments. Dragoo photographed it, measured it, described it, and moved on. He did not ask why this individual was so large. He did not propose a study of Adena skeletal proportions. He did not suggest genetic analysis, which admittedly did not exist in the form we know it today, but the question itself could have been framed. He simply recorded what he found and published it. Webb and Snow had done something similar a decade earlier, documented the large skeletal type, noted the robust features, the pronounced mandibles, the brachycranial skulls, and then folded it into a general description of Adena culture without ever isolating the size question as a subject worthy of its own investigation. This is the pattern that troubles me more than any single skeleton. It is not that the evidence was hidden, it is that the evidence was recorded, published, archived, and then never pursued. No one asked the next question. If the Adena were consistently producing individuals of 6.5 to 7.5 feet in height, and the skeletal record says they were, then what was the mechanism? Pituitary gigantism and Marfan syndrome produce extreme height, but they also produce fragile bones and joint pathology. The Adena remains show the opposite: dense bone, heavy muscle attachment, robust frames. A population producing that phenotype without pathological markers implies something that the existing categories of physical anthropology are not designed to explain. I am not offering an answer. I am noting that no one with the credentials and the funding has formally posed the question. The bones are in Washington. The technology for genetic and isotopic analysis has existed for more than 2 decades. The study has not been proposed. In 1894, when Cyrus Thomas published his report, he documented the full extent of the Kanawha Valley complex: 50 mounds, 8 to 10 circular enclosures, stone constructions on the bluffs, earthworks stretching for miles along both banks of the river. Today, nearly all of it is gone. The circles that flanked the Criel Mound were levelled for roads and buildings before anyone thought to map them with modern instruments. The stone mounds on the bluffs were dismantled for construction material. The smaller burial mounds were ploughed flat by farmers or bulldozed for development. An entire archaeological landscape, one of the most significant concentrations of prehistoric monumental architecture in North America, was systematically erased in the space of about a century, not by conspiracy, by indifference, by the ordinary machinery of a growing city that needed the land more than it needed the past. The Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville survived. It was too large to ignore, and it had a museum built around it. In 2010, the Army Corps of Engineers transferred nearly 450,000 artifacts recovered from Kanawha Valley excavations to the Delft-Nerona Museum at the site. 450,000 objects from one river valley, And yet the museum's permanent exhibit gives you a responsible, measured, carefully neutral account of the Adena that mentions nothing about the exceptional size of the individuals buried in the mounds that produced those artifacts. If you have been watching this channel for a while, you know I do not say things like this lightly. But if what I have laid out today matters to you, if you think this evidence deserves to be examined rather than stored, then leave a comment below, hit like, and share this with someone who pays attention to what gets left out of the official version. The algorithm decides what people see. You decide whether this stays visible. Here is what I keep coming back to. A man was buried 31 feet below the surface of a mound that took years to build. He was broad-shouldered, thick-skulled, encased in a copper headband. 10 people were placed around him in a circle, with their feet pointing toward him, as though he was the centre of something. Not just the centre of the mound, but the centre of whatever these people understood their world to be. A few miles away, inside another mound, another man, this one measured at 7 feet 6 inches by the same expedition leader, was sealed in a timber house with 5 others arranged around him. The same valley, the same culture, the same ritual logic. Norris measured them, Thomas published them, the Smithsonian collected them. And then the only thing that happened was nothing. No research program was launched, no museum exhibit was built around the central question of who these people were and what produced them. The bones went to Washington. The mounds stayed in West Virginia, the circles were paved over, and a historical marker was placed at the base of the Criel Mound that tells you everything you need to know to walk away without thinking twice. I do not know who the man at the centre of that vault was. I do not know what the Adena called themselves, or why a culture that built monuments requiring the coordinated labour of hundreds, that traded across half a continent, that buried their leaders in timber rooms beneath artificial mountains, in geometric formations that imply a cosmology we cannot read. I do not know why that culture vanished and left nothing behind but earth and bone. But the bones exist, the measurements exist, the photograph in Dragoo's book exists, the field notebook in the Smithsonian archives exists, and no one with the authority to answer the obvious question has chosen to ask it. The Criel Mound is still standing. 33 feet of earth, raised by hand over a wooden room, where 11 people were laid in a pattern that someone thought was important enough to preserve for 3,000 years. Whatever the answer is, it is in that room. It has been there since before Rome was founded, and it is waiting.